When it comes to the Turtles, I endeavoured to experience any of their latest offerings with an open mind, as my reverence and nostalgia for them begins with the 2003 series that, in my mind, pioneered the Turtles for the modern age, with incredible continuity, intensely written characters, dynamic action set pieces, and, in my opinion, the strongest display of the Turtles and Shredder.
No, he's got a point.
Yet Paramount and Nickelodeon seem determined to expunge it from history with how little they reference it to make room for lesser titles like this. And quite honestly, all this movie reminds me of is simpler times, better animation, and a more profound quality.
I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them.
Anyway, that's enough reminiscing over grander days. The topic of today is how quickly this title retreated to the shadows following its release, as fundamentally this is not a good movie. Despite possessing components that have proven to work elsewhere within the vast multiverse of shell-tastic splendour, when the hours are put in to justify their existence with efficient writing that makes for enjoyable, refined storytelling. In short, Out of the Shadows is far from what I believe a Turtles movie should be, as it goes in hard on the concepts of mutants, Krang, Shredder, the Technodrome, and public perceptions of the Turtles without ever expanding on any of them, or defining the significance of them, which would be needed to tell the audience why these things matter. Instead, what this becomes is a victim of its own success, with weak deliveries on iconic characters, an over-reliance on tired humour, overstimulating visuals, name value to draw butts in seats, a confused narrative focus, hollow setups, and a screenplay that took less time to formulate than the idea of race-swapping the Little Mermaid.
It's funny because it's true.
Before I explain the issues of this one, allow me a moment to regale you in the tale of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows movie. We begin the first 15 minutes of this with just watching the Turtles eat pizza, screw up a basketball game, and Mikey steps out into a parade on the streets for a moment of turtle awesomeness.
Comedy.
While April is suddenly tracking down Baxter Stockman for his connections to the Shredder, and is convinced that he plans to break Shreds out of prison following the events of the last movie. But as she almost acquires the information that would confirm this, the intel starts deleting itself and this lands her back to square one. But then we shift over to Noboru Morai. Whoops, my bad. Oroku Saki, who's been transferred out of state alongside Sheamus and Riff Thompson, where the federal team is led by corrections officer Casey Jones, and along the way, the Foot proceed to attack the convoy and retrieve Shredhead, which makes the evening news and draws the Turtles into the fray. And this is where things go sideways when Stockman uses some random portal tech that Shredder jumps into and is interrupted during his travels, suddenly joining Commander Krang in Dimension X. Who offers a mutagenic compound in return for him retrieving 3 components that will make a machine capable of tearing the dimensional barrier that can bring him to Earth for an invasion. Upon his return to Earth, Shredder recruits Bebop and Rocksteady for his army, and Stockman uses the mutagenic compound to revert the pair to their dormant ancestral genes.
Well, that's just lazy writing.
And this of course is what reverts them to a Warthog and Rhino respectively. Meanwhile, April has been following them on their trails and in the chaos steals the remaining mutagen to give to Donnie, and after being pursued by the Foot, she's saved by Casey, who's gone rogue after his chief didn't believe him over the Foot attack, and it's here where he meets the Turtles. Later on, Donnie discovers the potential of the mutagen, and if its potency is reversed correctly, could be used to turn the Turtles into humans, which splits the group for a little while. But they can't worry about that right now, as they figured out there's apparently more mutagen at the police station, but I was under the impression April had stolen what was left.
Well,
that's just lazy writing.
But fuck it, anyway, this is basically done to present the Turtles to the public in a moment of necessity to help April and Casey, but the duo are just left for the police to handle anyway. And sometime after the second Krang component is recovered, Bebop and Rocksteady head out to Brazil to retrieve the final part, to which the Turtles follow. And after the fight ends catastrophically with the bad guys getting the component, the Turtles limp back to New York just in time for the arrival of Kang's Technodrome, where in a matter of minutes, the Shredder betrays Stockman, Shredder is frozen and locked away on Krang's ship, and the Turtles reveal themselves publicly, promising to resolve this matter with the police protection. And after defeating Krang by luring his tech back to Dimension X with the Shredder inside, April and Casey take out Bebop, Rocksteady and Karai. We end on the Turtles being honoured by the NYPD with an offer to safely disclose their existence to the public, but the boys agree to stay in the shadows and work with the police however they need. And we close on them celebrating their victory on the Statue of Liberty.
Good times.
Now, here's the first big issue with this movie: the overpopulated, bloated, and convoluted narrative that struggles to focus itself on any one thing for longer than 2 minutes, that it starts to resemble a cat on caffeine. Where compared to the last movie, this one has the introduction of Krang, Krang's plan, the freed components, the mutagen, Bebop and Rocksteady, Baxter Stockman, overextended fight sequences, plot conveniences, the potential for the turtle humanoids, public perceptions, and attempts at balancing in nuanced topics such as self-acceptance. And if that gave you a headache, try watching the damn thing. But before I spiral into those elements too deeply, I will preface this by saying that to its credit, this one does feel a little more lively, energetic, and turtle-y, as bizarrely in the last movie the named characters didn't enter the chat until almost 20 minutes in. But sadly, this movie just doesn't land as effectively as its predecessor, though I'd like to believe that if the two were merged, you'd have the makings of a decent addition. Out of the Shadows ultimately tries to dabble in too much in a desperate attempt to kick this over for a third movie, where a lot of the explanations would likely come from the absurd amount of busy work here regarding Dimension X, why Krang wanted Earth, and what the relationship between the Turtles and people would look like. Which I would have loved to see, although the 2012 series had already presented these questions and answered them for viewers rather effectively. However, having seen this, I'm left thinking if they couldn't be asked to do this properly, my suggestion would be to leave Krang and the public perceptions out of the story completely, and instead continue with the mutagen story in a more homely manner that could have just led to a mutant problem in Manhattan that held Shredder at the core and saw the creation of Stockman Fly, Rocksteady, Bebop, Mondo Gecko, Slash, etc., and just have this be an alternate take on the Toker and Razar story from Secrets of the Ooze. Then save the Krang for a third installment that could trace the mutagen's origins back to Earth and align with TCRI or something, given a bit more to April's father and Sax's creations in the first movie. Maybe retconning a few details or whatever, but this is just me fantasy booking. The idea of the Turtles becoming human is equally fascinating as it is unsettling, but I get the emotional crux of this is to present the Turtles with this existential crisis of identity where they have the chance to finally become part of society and be acknowledged for the good they've done across the city, but the fault of this idea just being thrown in as it is it becomes lost in the mess of everything else going on. And I'll be honest, I forgot that it was part of this until the gang took a moment to consider it, but had it had time to breathe, this could have offered so much potential for the Turtles' direction going forward and would have set this apart from the other incarnations. But for what it's worth, I did appreciate the resolution to such a quick concept where the boys decided to remain true to themselves and prove that not all mutants are enemies. But the formula of their infighting and Raph repeatedly questioning Leo's leadership made this feel rather stale in its development for them.
You're basic.
Then you remove the muddled state over the movie's plot and poor juggling act of its moving components. A huge fault in this movie is the lack of attention on its villains. And I'd argue that the attention was where it was needed on the Turtles and Casey, and as for April, she had the last movie, but Shredder, Krang, and Stockman all felt redundant. We never learned anything of them. Their motivations and objectives are never expanded on in any meaningful way, and personally I felt that the Shredder was done dirty here again.
You bastards!
Being treated as a subpar threat and then being carted over to Krang where he's basically submissive within seconds of meeting him, never takes a shot throughout this, leaving the heavy lifting to Sheamus and Rift Hampson, and gets taken out in a blink, then stored away on the Technodrome, which seemingly means that he's been carted over to Dimension X without so much as a howdy do.
You're on your own. See you, buddy.
And frankly, I think this is one of the biggest insults to this title and a disservice to the character of the Shredder, as your villain of a movie needs to be understood as a threat to your protagonists or you'll never believe that they're in any sort of danger, and it's clear that they were trying to work in that codependent relationship that the pair have in animation, which was never that amusing to me to begin with, as I appreciated the weighted exchanges between him and the Turtles in the 03 and 2012 iterations, but it felt egregiously out of place here and flies directly in the face of who Shredder was in the first movie, as this menacing agent of ninjutsu, making for a rather large consistency issue, especially with the recast as well. And this complaint falls in line with Krang and Stockman as well, where both never really felt like a credible threat in the grand scheme of things. Krang was kicked back to Dimension X without a shred of levity being offered to him, and the design was supposed to have the audiences taken more seriously, but it just came across as rather hokey.
It's funny because it's true.
And Stockman was taken off to never be heard from again, but I imagine had we had a third movie, he might have become the Stockman Fly that we know him to be.
Stockman Fly is Turflido's ultimate superhero enemy, Buzz Buzz.
Then lastly, for however much I enjoyed Stephen Amell's involvement in this, he felt wasted as Casey and never had that much chemistry with Megan as April, and for most of the movie the pair are just spending their time trying to convince NYPD that the Turtles exist and that they are good guys. However, I can't entirely sour on this movie, as there was one point of interest that grabbed me, and that was Bebop and Rocksteady, who honestly had the most charisma out of this and looked as repulsive as you'd expect for a humanoid hog and rhino, but that just added to them weirdly, and I could certainly believe their designs over the Turtles and Krang, but the chemistry between the duo kept me going throughout this one, and it improved on the relationship that we see the Mutant Maniacs have in the classic series and 2012 iterations. Sheamus especially over-delivered, and of almost all the wrestling appearances I've seen in movies, he was one of the best. Then, for what it's worth, the fight sequences might have been overdone, but they were enjoyable, particularly the brawl in Brazil, adding a flare of excitement for a few moments, but it does succumb to a lot of the Michael Bayisms as before, despite him not actually directing any of these movies.
Corporate needs you to find the differences between this picture and this picture. They're the same picture.
To sign off on this review though, it goes without saying that Out of the Shadows possesses a few decent ideas with equally stimulating visuals as its predecessor, but it's devoid of thought and compelling reason, packed out with tiresome humour, misuse of legacy characters, overextended fight sequences, a weightless plot, unintelligent dialogue, and for me it just leaves a rather bitter aftertaste. And frankly, there are better iterations of the Turtles out there, but if you don't look into things as deeply as I try to, then you'll still be able to enjoy yourself with it, as it does create a more colourful experience than before, but just struggles to balance the tone of itself and everything else within it, so it makes for a rather unpleasant experience for me. Anyway, that's all I've got for this one. I appreciate you stopping by. If you like this, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe if you're new for more like this down the road, and until next time everyone, take care, and I'll catch you later.